Welcome everyone to Authors at Drucker. Good morning. I'm Dave Specht, Director of the Global Family Business Institute, and I'll be your host for today's interview. At the Drucker School, we're striving to become the global meeting place for the world's most influential business owning families. And today's interview represents another step in that direction for us. I'm so excited for this conversation with Jim Grubman. Before I introduce him, I'd like to share a couple of exciting and important things that are happening for us at the Drucker School. The first is we recently launched our Certificate in Advising Family Enterprises program, where we partner with financial institutions, CPA firms, private banks, and others to train advisors to more effectively work with the family dynamics across passing businesses or financial wealth across generations. We've also just finished recording the Generational Wealth Masterclass content with Jay Hughes, and that will be available soon. So if you're interested in either one of those programs, please do send me an email at david.specht, S-P-E-C-H-T, @cgu.edu. And finally, each month we have this series, Authors at Drucker. It's an interview series that was sponsored by the James E. Hughes Foundation, and really appreciate Jay and Catherine for their investment in this program. The James E. Hughes Foundation, the mission is to advance the study of family governance and generational well-being. And we hope that Authors at Drucker, fulfills and aligns well with that mission. And again, I'm just excited for this opportunity for this conversation with Jim. So let me go ahead and stop sharing here for a second. All right. Well, now to the star of the show. I want to introduce Jim. Jim's a recognized consultant and thought leader in the space of generational wealth. He's consulted with The Millionaire Next Door to the Forbes 400 list. His goal is to integrate life and wealth for the benefit of the family and society, which I think is very well aligned with Peter Drucker and some of the things that he wanted to do and things that were important to him. So Jim, welcome to Authors at Drucker.
Well, glad to be here, Dave. You and I have talked quite a bit, and it looks like we have a good crowd, and we're going to have a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So to begin, Jim, I want to just start with the origin of the book, which I have right here, Strangers in Paradise. It's always fun to hear kind of the genesis story of, where did this start? And so let's, take us back to that, because this is not a brand new book and probably not a brand new idea for you, but give us a little background on where this began.
Well, it's funny when you say it's not a brand new book. What's stunning for me to think is next year will be 10 years since its publication, October of 2013, which is mind-boggling. So, yeah. The genesis of the book actually dated back to around 2006, 2007, when my wonderful collaborator and colleague, Dennis Jaffe, and I were working on what we intended to be the first comprehensive sort of summary or bibliography about psychology of wealth. There were articles before that on this or that, but we wanted to put some things together and cover the entire landscape. And we wrote what also now has become kind of a classic in the field of acquirers and inheritors to wealth, their different life purposes and journeys. And it was in that article and another one that came out around the same time in Journal of Financial Planning that we first broached the metaphor about immigrants and natives with wealth, and made reference to it. But it was an analogy that we just really were finding a good way to explain things. And then between then and around 2011 or so, that really seemed to take hold, and a lot of people showed interest, and I started getting comments like, this is really great. Is there a book about this? Can I learn or read more about it? And I was busy, with life and doing other things. And as you and I talked about, I have to give credit to the midwife of Strangers in Paradise, which was Lee Hausner, who is just a wonderful colleague. And she and I were talking, and she says, you need to write this book. And she hounded me and was my coach, and kept after me for what was a couple of years as I developed it. And I finally published it in the fall of 2013.
Fantastic. So there's a side tangent I want to go down too, because there's probably some people on this call that have dreamt of writing a book.
Whoa.
And you had it's not such a dreamy process.
Yeah, no.
You had some impetus though. You had a timing and a deadline, and I think this story is fantastic. Can you take us behind the curtain just briefly for your Malcolm Gladwell experience and why this book came out at the time that it did?
It really is quite the story, and part of the story is the book quite literally nearly killed me. So I was puttering along writing the book, as I said, and a separate parallel event occurred where Malcolm Gladwell contacted me because he was writing his book David and Goliath, which was the theme was when advantages can become disadvantages and disadvantages can be advantages. And he wanted to write about wealth as one of those advantages that sometimes can be a disadvantage. And people recommended that he talk to me about families of wealth. And I met him and we had a great conversation. Interestingly, I told him about the immigrants in his metaphor, which made his head explode because Malcolm himself comes from a pretty difficult background and had become very successful. And he immediately could relate to the metaphor. Anyway, his book, David and Goliath, essentially was developed and then planned to come out October, or I think it was November 1st of 2013.
So you had a
And
deadline.
I realized, and he cited me and talked about how parenting with wealth requires some adaptations. So all of a sudden I had an external motivation where it's like that when that book comes out, people are going to be looking for me and things related to it. So I need to finish Strangers in Paradise. And I busted various parts of my anatomy. And it was extremely stressful in September and October. And then the Friday that I uploaded the manuscript to Create Space and finished it, I went to sleep that night, woke up in the middle of the night, didn't feel very good, and had some very funny symptoms. And my wife wound up taking me to the ER where my blood pressure was 220 over 120. And they were a little concerned about me. So I spent a day or two in the hospital. They got my blood pressure down and it all was fine. But when I was in the ER, they said, have you been under a little bit of stress lately? So be careful what you wish for when you write a book.
Thank you for taking us into that backstory. I think we should just dive right in now. What I'd like to do is, obviously the most important part of this book is the analogy of the immigration. Can you take us through kind of some of the nuances of the immigration parallel and the analogy that you used with immigrants?
Well, the derivation of it that got Dennis and me thinking was we tended to follow the research on the demographics of wealth. And despite what general society believes about the rich, what we really knew from long-term studies was that around 80% of the wealthy come to that wealth in their lifetime, growing up originally from a lower economic class and making the journey to the land of wealth. And so we realized that the wealth population is populated by people who did not come from there. And, skipping ahead, that basically when we stripped away looking at wealth as class and just thought of it as culture, from socioeconomic culture. All of a sudden it made sense, which is if you grow up in one culture and you make a change to another socioeconomic culture, you are an immigrant. But if you are born and raised in that culture, you're native to that culture. And so that became the immigrants and natives metaphor. But what happened in writing Strangers was I really took a deep dive into the cross-cultural psychology literature. And that's where I discovered how many parallels there really were. And so in my mind, and when I talk about it intensively, it really is the cultural model of wealth. We tapped into all the many really well-researched aspects about who tends to make a journey like that, what the coping strategies are for when you change cultures, what the different variations are, including which strategies actually tend to predict better outcome. Even small things like for natives of wealth, say in G2, birth order, and how kids who, if they make the change or the migration under the age of 5, they only remember the new situation. They know the new situation. They don't remember the old country. If kids are over the age of about 13, they have a lot of immigrant characteristics because they grew up a lot in the old country. And that explained a lot, for example, among siblings in wealthy families in G2, where the older ones often are a lot more like the parents and have values and attitudes from general society, and the younger ones know wealth and may be very different.
Yeah. So I live in a community that's probably 60% Hispanic, and there's a large number of them that are first generation.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was reading the book, I was thinking about the level of empathy for that group just continued to rise and rise and rise. And you see the first generation that comes does not speak the language of this country. They're hardworking, but they're just trying to figure it out, trying to survive.
Exactly.
And then they have kids that grow up in their home, hearing Spanish, speaking Spanish, but when they go to school, quickly, kindergarten to second grade, and they're fluent in English. So,
Yes.
they're only speaking Spanish really in the homes. And then you get out to the third generation. This is the saddest thing that I witnessed is you have grandchildren that can't even communicate with their grandparents. And so as you think about just communication, how would you apply, some of those concepts to your model?
Well, there are huge parallels. And when I have worked with multi-generational families, we often talk about that, including, by the way, Dave, there are some people that I call sort of dual immigrants, those who make a geographic journey, and those who make an economic journey. And many of those often talk about the economic immigration is more profound and sometimes more difficult than the geographic migration. But you're absolutely right. With each generation, as you move away from the original immigrant, the life experience is different, their perspectives, and sometimes some things are lost, but also, and this is where cross-cultural psychology comes in, the main issue is how well is the family adapting to the new culture?
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, like with the Hispanic families that you see, beginning to let go of some of the things from the old country can feel like a betrayal.
Yes.
It can feel like a loss, and you can get anger across the generations that people are not holding on to where the family came from. There can sometimes be a lack of appreciation for making reasonable acculturation, which is the process of adaptation. And so you can get tensions across generations, or you can get a family that tries to find that blend of preserving their heritage while adjusting to the new environment. And as we know that actually those families that do that tend to have the best outcome.
Jim, the way that I think about it is, I think about it as almost an empathy crisis. And you know, if it's the new natives, you know, they're not always empathetic towards those that immigrated, and those that immigrated are also not always that empathetic towards the natives and their new land that they're navigating in. Do you have any
Absolutely.
thoughts? You have any thoughts
Well,
around that?
I'm thinking here about a family I once worked with that demonstrated a lot of that. It's actually one of the main reasons why they brought me in and I was working with the family. Was there a lot of tension and disagreement across the generations? Grandma and grandpa said, these kids don't know where we came from. We try and explain, we try and tell them some stuff, and they say, yeah. And when I talked with the G2s and the younger G3s, they rolled their eyes and they said, yeah, we've heard these stories so many times of, the hard scrabble life and how they, scrimped and saved and this and that. And it's like, we can't relate to it and we're not even sure it really applies. And it's like, we've heard the stories, like, what good is that? We got to live now. And the G1s were angry and, as I said, felt betrayed and didn't want to hear about what the G3s needed.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what I worked with them on was understanding how normal this is. Normalizing it is one of the things that using this metaphor really helps with families on a practical basis. It also levels the playing field. With wealth, we actually esteem the G1 immigrants, and natives often don't get a lot of respect. Sometimes with ethnic families, the G1s are disdained, and the ones who are in America and doing well and whatever are elevated. So the power situation is sometimes a little different, depending upon the family. This levels the field where sort of like everybody has something to bring to the table. The G1s or the immigrants, they have a perspective on the new environment that is helpful. But, the G2s and the G3s, this is their land. They may know it better than the founders, and they may know what some of the issues are, the needs, the stresses. So I often get generations talking with each other a little bit more equally, that everybody has something to bring to the table. There's just different perspectives.
What I'd like to talk about now is kind of the migration patterns. So some of my friends in my community came by themselves. I mean, by themselves, in crazy stories of how they arrived here.
Yes.
And others came together. And when you think about this migration to the land of wealth, I'm guessing that plays itself out every day. So can you talk about maybe the different migration patterns with families migrating to wealth together, or individuals kind of making that run, and maybe some others feeling left behind, and then what is some of the dynamic that gets created there?
Well, what you're touching on is really a very important aspect. For example, often somebody who creates an operating business or even a family business is not doing it alone. We hear about businesses started by, three brothers or, two cousins or something like that. And so there are people in a family moving across time, making the migration to the land of wealth together. The other thing, very importantly, is you often have a husband and wife. You may have siblings, but particularly couples who are making that journey to success together. And remember I mentioned about how I tend to watch the demographic studies about the wealthy. One of the things that angered me actually is in the statistics about what's the origin of your individual net worth, of your wealth. They would call the founders or the business creator self-made. But then when the spouse, the widow, inherited the money, they would call her an inheritor. And in actuality, for a husband and wife who build a business together and make the journey from adversity to wealth, she's an immigrant. she's not a native like another generation would be. And so I realized that the population of those who were considered to be inheritors was really tainted by calling widows and spouses inheritors rather than understanding they were immigrants to wealth.
Yeah.
But it causes a lot of stress in families. I worked with one extended family where one branch of the family was very successful, but an unspoken issue for a lot of families is brothers and sisters, siblings who are still back in the old country, don't have much money. And so getting a finely grained idea of who's along on the journey, how well they're coping together, because one person can be adapting quite well and the other person can have a lot of trouble. And the extended family of the people who are making the journey, who are still connected with the family of origin or friends that are back in the old country. This is what really fleshes out adjustment.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Those that are making that migration and those that do not make it with them, some feel like pulling them back to the homeland. Like, have you've forgotten who you are? You've abandoned us. And anyways, I just approach this with so much empathy because there's so many dynamics to deal with, and most that create wealth recognize that they did not do it by themselves. But even if they had help from others, the others don't always benefit in the same way that they did, and so there's kind of mismatched financial benefits. Anyways, it's just...
No, it's a great point, and interestingly, what you are talking about is why I and many others, including many people on this call, take a systemic perspective. That it's not just if you think about those concentric circles, there's the individual and how he or she is adjusting to immigrating to wealth. There's the couple, there's the family, there's the extended family, including parents and siblings. There are the friends and the communities that people come from. And so when we work with families, you have to be aware of what's happening at every one of those levels, because very often, several levels are contributing to some of the challenges that the person might be going through.
Yeah. What I'd like to do now, Jim, is I want to share this model of adjusting to the new culture. Sure. And have you walk us through that, because I think it's really helpful to understand the balance, or sometimes the lack of balance, between maintaining that previous culture and identity and accepting and incorporating some of the new culture and identity. Will you just take a minute and walk us through that?
Sure. This is actually, when I train advisors, we go over this a lot. This is straight out of cross-cultural psychology and the work of John Barry there on the different strategies of acculturation that people can have. And one of the things that he demonstrated is that basically your individual adjustment and the strategy that you use is influenced by two major dimensions. The one dimension, and here at the top and kind of in the blue, is the degree to which you hold on to or let go of the identity, attitudes, and behaviors of the culture that you came from, matched to the degree to which you take on or keep away the identity, culture, attitudes, and behaviors of the new culture that you find yourself in now. So when you plot that as a field, and it is a field, it's not points on a line, and that's really important. We'll come back to that. You actually get 4 quadrants in the field. Let's start with the lower left, avoidance. And in the psychology literature, this is actually called the strategy of separation. And this is where people hold on to and keep mostly the identity that they have from where they came from, and they reject or do not take on the new culture. And although general society thinks that when people become rich, they lose themselves and just become like the Kardashians and are very materialistic, we all have seen that the reality is very often people do that with wealth. They say, look, we don't want this to change us. We're not going to be any different. Being middle class is the best way to be. We're middle class. We just happen to have a lot of money. And they often see wealth as toxic. In the upper right corner is the strategy of assimilation, in which people actually want to assimilate. And that means they let go of much of where they came from and they embrace where they are now. And so for your analogy to your Hispanic neighborhood, these would be people who, as soon as much as possible, drop speaking Spanish. The home looks American. They want their kids to be American, and they want to let go of the Hispanic culture where they came from as completely as possible. And we see this with some of the wealthy that, like Jay Gatsby, who hid his own background. These are people who actually, want to walk away from their middle class attitudes, behaviors, and appearance, and they want to be richer than the rich in what they do. In the upper left corner is the integration strategy, and that is sort of, a blend. It's trying to find the best of both worlds. And this is where people have a strategy of kind of mix and match, and figuring out situations based upon, how much can I remain the same or approach this with what I know? How much can I learn and do things differently that's more appropriate for my new reality? What we know from the cross-cultural literature is that the integration strategy actually tends to have the best long-term outcome. We can come back to that if you want.
So let me stop you just for a second, Jim.
Sure.
As you think about an integration strategy, what are some of the tools that these families are using to actually have a strategy of integration?
The strategy of integration, in some ways, is the hardest strategy, but it is the best because it's the most thoughtful and the most finely grained. If you take the avoidance or assimilation strategies, most of your decisions about what to do are straightforward. You always decide it one way. Avoiders always choose where they came from. Assimilators will always choose what they think of where they are now. When you take an integration strategy, as I had one client once years ago said, you have to think about everything on its own merits. It's like, you have to adjust parenting, and, there's a zillion dilemmas and decisions that have to be made. And so people have to judge and juggle, how do I want to handle this one? So it takes a little more effort. To what degree do you want to use your wealth and live comfortably and have financial security, and nice vacations and things like that? But at the same time, how are you going to handle the fact that you have to talk to your kids about the decisions that you're making and how you spend your money? So the integration strategy often requires a little more effort, but in the end, it pays off because you're able to craft how you want to live your life now with wealth.
So I have one other follow-up question on that. As you're thinking about this integration strategy and some of the other, options, does this always start at an individual level, or does it begin at the family level, or how does that really happen?
Well, what I would say is it is dynamic and interactive. And that's why, again, this is a field and not a point. People can be halfway, you can be a mild avoider, kind of halfway to integration. You can be moving around in this field here. Let's go back to something you and I talked about, which is couples. That one of the things that this predicts is at the individual level, somebody may be inclined to take an integration approach. Their spouse may be an avoider. That's often where couples conflicts start, where, say, she says, we're going to be taken advantage of. I don't want our kids to know. We shouldn't change anything. And he says, well, I think we could lighten up and use this, and the kids could know and whatever. No. So when the couple was living back in more difficult financial circumstances, they might have had some different money personalities, or as we say now, money scripts, but they didn't have much money to drive a wedge into that. The migration to wealth now really drives a wedge into how they're coping, and you can often see couples start to fall apart that way. Assimilators and integrators, same thing. One wants to spend more, one wants to be more balanced with it.
So the last one is marginalization. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, actually, could we put that one back up again for a second?
Yeah.
Because I think it's really important.
Yep.
There we go. It's funny because 10 years ago, when I wrote Strangers and had to think about how long the book was going to be and what I kept in and what I took out, I make reference to the marginalization strategy, but I don't address it very much. I've actually been thinking about doing a 10-year update, and I would talk more about the marginalization strategy in the current environment of diversity and inclusion. The marginalization strategy predicts something that we do find. It's sort of a failure to thrive strategy, that those who struggle with being marginalized, they actually kind of have the worst of both worlds. They find that they may have to let go of or no longer feel comfortable with the culture and the communities that they were a part of, but they may not fit in or be accepted by the culture that they are now in. And you see this with people of color, minorities, people, the growing number of people who actually are becoming wealthy in a non-traditional way, but they may not be accepted or feel fully comfortable in the standard sort of white privileged environment of wealth. And the marginalization strategy can really make some people struggle. And I think this is where we need to pay the people there more attention. I think that there's more services and resources now, but I think going ahead in the future, being able to find, focus on, and help those people who come to wealth from marginalized communities, we can help move them and help them adjust there to something that serves a little bit more as integration for them.
Such a rich dialogue. My goodness,
it really is.
The framework is so powerful. I want to talk now about just the people. You do a really excellent job of making some people distinctions and almost using as archetypes. And you talk about, natives who expand the wealth, natives who unlock the wealth. We talk about some of those kind of subgroups of people and how they fit.
Yes, and it's funny because I have often presented to client forums and groups, and it's some of these exceptions or subgroups that often bring out some of the most interesting questions and issues. For example, in the book and in my work, I talk about natives who grow the wealth much bigger, who may be starting off in upper middle class life or high net worth areas, but because they're entrepreneurial, they, to use the analogy, sort of, take the family much higher up into the mountains of the land of wealth. And what those people report, and why this metaphor is helpful, is it's sort of like they know the land of wealth. It doesn't feel foreign to them. They have a general sense about how wealth management works, the attitude, the language, and yet they are entrepreneurial and they have the benefits of kind of being wealth creators. So they kind of get the best of both worlds there, where the wealth feels earned rather than just inherited, and yet they didn't start off so far away from it like maybe G1 did.
Yeah.
Another one.
I was going to say that's a group though that sometimes, because they're not immigrants, because they didn't start it, they don't get full credit,
Yes, exactly.
And that's a group that I think can, somewhat have a chip on their shoulder, not really know where they fit as well, because they're not founders, but they're definitely entrepreneurs. But some founders wouldn't categorize them as entrepreneurs because they didn't start it. And so I have a lot of empathy for that group too. And there may be a lot of those people on this call today.
Well, actually, you make a great point, Dave, that those people sometimes don't get a lot of credit, even in those demographic studies. It's like, well, they inherited some and then they were self-made. If you have $15 million and you create a business that grows to 800 million or 1.5 billion, that's a significant journey. And the fact that you started off in a family that had 15 or 20 million dollars, it's like, that's still quite an achievement and you've come a long way. But again, general society views the rich as this homogeneous group, and they don't really understand the nuances of it.
Would you talk just for a second about wealthy but not native?
Yes. Well, it's funny because we can talk about wealthy but not native and native but not wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
There are inheritors and people who have money but have never been prepared or trained or understand what's going on. So they are really like the people who have a lot of money but really don't understand the land of wealth and have not been used to it, and is very disruptive and difficult. The other one is what we often hear about though and see, which is, they come from old money, they lost all of that, but they still think that they're old money. And in the cultural model of wealth, it makes perfect sense. Culture changes much more slowly across generations than the money. And if you're G2 or G3 or G4, and then the money goes away in some way, but you understand education, you grew up in certain places, it's a state of mind. It's a level of understanding. It's like, this is your culture, socioeconomic culture, whether or not you still have the money. And so people often don't understand. It really is about the culture and not the money.
Yeah, and that is fascinating. And again, as you go out generations, it can be that you can have the last name of a branch that created wealth, but you not have any wealth. And
Right.
I can't think of anything more uncomfortable than people assuming that you have this great wealth and that you don't, and some of the unique human dynamics that creates. I mean, especially you have a family business with the last name on the family business, and you're a cousin. Well, your parents never worked in the family business. Those types of dynamics. There's just so many interesting parts and pieces to this.
It is, and in essence, what you are touching on is why this model has become so useful. What general society knows about, thinks about, has stereotypes about the rich from the outside, looking at the land of wealth, but not living there, is very different. And most of the time, what has gotten all the attention is making the journey, how to go from here to there and arrive at the land of wealth on the shores, and you're going to live happily ever after. And what Dennis and I did with this, and many others have continued, is, but what is like when you get to the land of wealth and having made the migration, who is there? what are the adjustment issues, how to think about it. And our focus has been on what it's like living in the land of wealth once you actually arrive.
Yeah. Well, I want to preserve some time. I don't want to hog all the time. So I want to turn to the Q&A now. And if you have questions, please do feel free to share those in the chat, and I'll be looking at those. The first question comes from Stephen Gray, Jim, and it says, how can the culture metaphor be applied to a business family in which all living generations have grown up in the wealth culture? So there's there's a shared perspective of entitlement which handicaps them in some important ways.
Well, it's a complicated question.
It is.
I like the first half of it. I'm not so ecstatic about some of the assumptions in the second. And
let's start with the first.
We'll go with the first. I think this is a great point, which is, say if you're into G3 or G4 and there's been liquidity, because not everybody with a family business actually encounters liquid wealth that much. Sometimes it's tied up and kept away. But if the family is generally, living an affluent lifestyle, native to wealth, and it's been long enough that this is what they're used to, first of all, there's a sense of community. It actually contributes to cohesion. They also connect with other families who have familiarity and comfort with wealth. The second part of the question about the risk, because it is a risk, it's not a prediction, which is that sometimes, like in any culture, things can become kind of cloistered, insular, that some of the skills related to general society can start to atrophy. Perspective on different economic classes can begin to atrophy and go away. That what we often think is the likely or natural progression for multi-generational wealth is to go this way and to become handicapped. My work with Wealth 3.0 and Dennis and Kristen Keffler and I, what part of what we're advocating is, wait a minute, this is not guaranteed. And in fact, it may not even be as prevalent as we have assumed. Yes, many wealthy multi-generational families start to go and drift in this direction with entitlement. But actually, many families resist that. And a lot of what consultants can do, and families themselves, is to keep alive a healthy kind of adaptation. Remember integration, where you keep and hold on to elements from where you came from? I think the more that's lost there, the more a family can drift into some of the problems and challenges of wealth. But a lot of families work really hard in G3, G4, and beyond to preserve the values that made them strong in the first place. And that does offset a risk or tendency toward entitlement.
Thanks, Jim. Let's go to Dawn. Dawn asks, Jim, do you think about whether this thinking is more important to understanding oneself in a wealthy family or understanding others?
Ooh, great question. Also a complicated question. One of the things that actually I learned from the cross-cultural psychology literature was the difference between adjustment and adaptation, because we often use them kind of synonymously. Adjustment is at the individual level. How am I adjusting to this change that's occurred for me in economic terms? The adjustment of the individual, which is for every individual in the system, is important. But if you aggregate it, what you then begin to see is the family adapting over time and changing in ways that are, we got some funny noise.
I think we're getting some background noise. Allison, can you make sure everyone's muted, please? Thank you.
when you think about not only your own adjustment, but the adjustment of those around you, that's when you start to think about collective adjustment, and that predicts adaptation. Is the whole family struggling? Are some people doing well and some people, and actually this is really common, G1s and G2s and sometimes G3s will take an avoidance strategy because they say, we're going to stay down to earth. We're not going to get fancy. You shouldn't flaunt your wealth. And there's a strong ethic in the family of that. By G3 and particularly G4, that starts to become less and less tenable when you get more liquid wealth. And families can often struggle where the ones who want to loosen up a bit feel constrained by the heritage of the avoidance strategy in the family. You can get, to the question, you can get conflicts among people in the family where some people defend the traditional approach. No, we shouldn't flaunt it. Don't spend that much. You have way too big of a house. Your cars are too fancy. Versus those who say, actually, I think we're handling it reasonable and this can be done without losing ourselves. So how the family is collectively making its adjustment and then as a group is adapting over time is a very important issue for families that we often have to deal with.
Thank you, Jim. I have another question here. If you were speaking to a new immigrant to the land of wealth and they seem lost and a bit unsatisfied, what steps might you take to help them?
Wonderful. One of the things that this predicts and really is part of kind of the newer approaches with wealth is, to what extent has anybody been prepared for the cultural change that they're going through? One thing we haven't really talked about here is, what about the in-laws and partners who marry in from general society? They're immigrants to wealth, overnight immigrants. And often they really do struggle because nobody is orienting them to the land of wealth. Nobody's helping them with their adjustment. They're lost and on their own. So being untrained and unprepared, people not telling you, the language, the behaviors, the principles, what is a family office, can undercut and compound adjustment. But then on the individual level, if, for example, an immigrant to wealth really has been steeped in where they came from, in the stereotypes about wealth as being bad, there's cognitive dissonance when they actually become wealthy. Because on one hand, they looked at those rich people who were all terrible, entitled, spoiled, self-centered, lacking empathy, narcissistic, and now they are one. And so some immigrants really struggle with the adjustment because their circumstances and their mental template of those people are clashing. So level of preparation and degree to which you have cognitive dissonance and struggle to make sense of where you're at. Those are two big factors, and advisors and consultants can help with both of those.
Jim, I've been thinking about a concept. I know there's, we talk about, you heard about shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves and clogs to clogs, but this one's different.
Okay.
I want to talk about bars to bars.
So we're going bars to bars tonight?
Bars to bars, not those bars. I want to talk about bars on the windows, meaning from, a place of, it's not even safe, but we have to live there. It's a tough neighborhood environment, to then leaving that, immigrating to some success. And then we're back to bars again. We build big walls, we gate our communities, we keep people out. And I'm curious, like, how does that, this is a new concept for me, I'm kind of working on, but how does that fit with the immigrant model or not?
It's a great point. And the common thread is isolation. When people live in dangerous neighborhoods and don't have just physical security because of their socioeconomic adversity and scarcity circumstances. It creates a worldview, which is that the world is a dangerous place, and they often think money will protect them if they became rich. And then they become rich. And sometimes what they do is they fulfill that need for not just financial security, but physical security by creating an enclave and all of that. Ironically, those people who are doing it for that motivation often feel much better. They feel, thank God we're in a safe environment. My kids don't have to worry about getting shot. They create the physical security that they wished for. But you point out that many of the wealthy also live in circumstances where they don't really know their neighbors. They are behind the hedges and the walls, and they don't have connection, human social connection.
I would say oftentimes there's an assumption of bad intention towards them as well.
Yes,
And
which
so
is not altogether untrue. Yeah,
not altogether untrue, but it's just curious to me to see those dynamics and how they play out.
You make a good point, which is, a lot of people have that stereotype, which is the rich have a target on their back. There is something I talk about in the book, and is well known, of the hostile envy of the rich, which is a reality, and in today's world with wealth inequality may be growing. So the idea that the wealthy are not altogether safe and secure is not that unfounded, but it's very different if that's a general attitude, and that you have to think about it as being wealthy, compared to if you came from a place where you actually truly were physically unsafe. And so people play out through money not only their needs and concerns about financial security. Money comes into play about physical security and whether or not you see the world as a dangerous place.
Yeah. I have another question here, Jim. It says, what are some good ways to get conversations started about families' relationships with wealth if those have been treated as taboo and off limits in the past? So some
You
people
mean
that
to
are
talk
new to
about it as taboo, or?
Yeah, talking about it is taboo.
Well, it's funny. I see that as a major change as we go across generations. People really lacked the skills for communicating about these sorts of things in prior generations, and there's been more of a trend for open communication. What I look for when I work with particularly the wealth creators or in G1 who are hesitant about talking, there actually is a whole set of attitudes and beliefs that go together, which is, I don't know if it's good that we do talk about it. I'm not sure I know how to talk about it. I think if we talk about it, it will make things worse because it will demotivate the kids. They don't need to know, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole set of 6 or 8 beliefs that support not talking. It's not just, you shouldn't talk about money. When you probe, there's actually reasons behind it. What I tend to work with is those beliefs. What people really need to be heard about that unlocks it is, what are you trying to achieve? Because notice in those beliefs about, I don't want to talk about money because I think bad things will happen. All right. You see risk in that.
Avoid.
Yes.
Avoid rather than achieve. What are you trying to achieve rather than what are you trying to avoid? I love
right. That they see risk in talking. And what I do is I say, actually, you're right. There is risk in talking. I have some ways to handle that risk that are a little different, though. Would you like to hear about those? And I find that that's an assessment of the severity of something like avoidance. Because if somebody says, okay, yeah, like, how do you handle that? that means they're more of a mild avoider. If somebody says, no, I'm pretty convinced, I don't need to hear about it. It's like, okay, don't waste your breath. This person's going to stick with it.
Yeah.
But I think you have to look past the, no, we shouldn't talk about it, or we haven't talked about it, to why to talk and how do you handle the risks of talking.
Beautiful. Jim, we only have a couple minutes left. I want to just leave some space for you to have any closing comments about whether about Strangers in Paradise or just about the topic in general. And then
Well, I think it's funny. I mean, to be honest with you, I continue to be stunned by what Strangers in Paradise became. I never, when I wrote the book, imagined what it would be. And I just want to mention, by the way, I put some human anecdotes in there where I talked about 3 different couples who exemplified that. That was almost an afterthought. And yet people often say that's part of the book that they enjoyed the most. So you never know. And so I think it also is the genesis of what Dennis and I worked later on, ethnic cultures, and the fact that in different cultures, the journey to wealth looks very different and causes different sorts of opportunities and challenges. And again, 10 years on, I'm thinking much of Strangers still stands quite well. I may go back and first of all, I will get rid of that section where I endorse shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And that whole thing was very much sort of a Wealth 2.0 little section. But I think the world is starting to move on, and I think we can build on the core principles of it, which are holding up really well, and focus a little bit more on the strengths and positivity, because it really is about resilience. How do people adapt and adjust in ways so that they are successful?
Yeah, I like to think about agency, you know, and the choices that we have, and life doesn't just happen to us. And with this group, they have choices, and I think you do
Absolutely.
a beautiful job of talking about that and making that accessible. So
You can change your strategy in acculturation. That was one of the most important things that came of it. These were not like fixed elements. These are strategies, and people can learn and change their strategy and do better with it. That's exactly what it's about.
perfect. Jim, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I'm just going to close with a couple of housekeeping items here. I'm going to share my screen. Next month, we will have Amy Hart Klein on December 15th, talking about finding her voice and creating a legacy. And then in January, we'll have Chad Ford come and talk about his book, Dangerous Love, which is about conflict and how to navigate conflict in the world. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for Authors at Drucker. If you have comments or interest in any of the topics that we talked about, please feel free to email us. And if there is a book that you would like us to highlight, an author you'd like us to bring on, we'd take those suggestions as well. Have a great day, everybody. And thanks again, Jim, for joining us on Authors.
Thanks for having me, Dave.